tutorial will go through the primary functions and features of the PlantLog mobile app. The mobile app is essentially a companion app to the main PlantLog O&M logging software. It is a free download on the iOS App Store or the Android Play Store. It is designed primarily for data collection, where it will allow operators to go out and perform their facility rounds and collect the data on their assets while physically in front of those assets. It also can contain a subset of the asset history. This is helpful for the operators to refer to pertinent and recent information about those assets while they're in front of the equipment. However, it's only a subset, so full asset histories and the ability to do trending and analysis is not really possible here in the mobile app. That is really meant to be done in the PlantLog web application. Okay, let's get started by signing in. The first bit of information we need to enter is the site address. Given that PlantLog is an internet-based service, a site address is really just an internet address, which always ends in plantlog.com. But the first part of that address is your actual site identifier. And this can be the name of your company or maybe a unique identifier for your facility. Given that we're using a demo account here, our unique identifier or site is PL Demo. So let's go ahead and enter PL Demo. That's our unique site address. And then we will end it with .plantlog.com. Now, given that this is just an internet address, this is actually how you would access the PlantLog web application. You would simply take this address and put it into a standard desktop browser, and that's how you would access the web application. Okay, we will now sign in with a user account. I will use my favorite NFL player, and then we will put in our password. Now, at this very moment, we will need an internet connection on this device. That could be we should be either nearby a wireless router for Wi-Fi, or it could be a cell phone which has cellular data capabilities. But this is an internet-based service, and we need to authenticate with the main server. Hence, we need internet connection at this very moment. So let's go ahead and sign in. We have now signed in, and given that we just authenticated with the main server, PlantLog mobile app is now in what we call offline mode. We can now proceed in using all the features within the mobile app without the need of an internet connection. So at this very moment, internet is no longer required. Now, before we get into the actual features within the mobile app, let's first go over some basic navigation within the mobile app. So the first thing to notice is the upper header section here. You can see that it says logs now, and this is indicating where we are in the mobile app. Whenever you sign in, you're always taken to the top level of one of the features in the mobile app. And what determines where you are taken to is wherever the app was left off the last time someone used this app. So obviously the last person using it was using the logs feature, so we are taken straight back to the logs, the top level logs page. So this top page will always indicate where you are within the app. This bottom section here will vary depending on what page you are on. So it will always include the buttons and controls that let you interact with the feature or page that you are currently viewing here in the center section. So that we'll get into that more details when we go through the features. And then finally, when you are at the top level page for any given feature, you will always see the menu button down here in the lower left. And this is a way to navigate from one feature section to the other. So if we click on this, the nav panel slides out from the left. And we can see here that we're on the logs page because it's highlighted in blue. But we can transfer over to another feature, such as the journals by the nav panel. And we can also do some other actions here, which we'll go into more detail later on. But real briefly, I'll just mention that when you are done collecting data offline here in the mobile app, you will open up the nav panel and click on the sync button. And that will transfer all that data that you collected into the main internet service. And obviously at this point is when you will need internet connectivity once again. And finally, we have sign out, and this is something you probably want to get into a habit of doing. At the end of your shift, you want to sign out, especially if this device is shared among other operators. And this means that the next operator or engineer that picks up this device will be forced to sign in with their own credentials, rather than just picking up the device, and they could potentially create data under your user account, which you want to avoid. And when you're done, you simply click the menu button again to return back to the main page that you were on. So the logs feature is actually by far the most prominent feature within the PlantLog software. In fact, it's even part of the name. If you're not familiar with exactly what logs are and what you're seeing here on the screen, you should first watch the overview and concepts video, which will explain that in a little more detail. But I'll try to touch on that as I go through here. So we're brought here first to the main level of the logs feature, which is here on this main screen. What you're going to see first is these top level groups that an administrator has already set up for this particular account. Groups, or these blue folders, are really just a way to divvy up your equipment and assets within your facility. You could see something completely different for your facility, but it should be familiar to you because an admin, or it could have been you, has actually defined it specific to your facility. So in this demo database, we can see that these groups are laid out mainly based on functional equipment, chillers, electrical, mechanical, things like that. But groups might also be arranged in a way that's more geographical. So you could have a top level folder that says main building, and another one for west building or west wing or something to that effect. But generally the idea is you're placing the logs or your assets within these groups. And this helps us humans to figure out where these assets are actually located or what type of equipment they actually are. So that's groups. Another thing to notice here right off the bat is that two of these groups have bells laid on top of them. Now an administrator can actually set up schedules for when they want assets to be checked or when certain activities on those assets need to be performed. So when those recurring schedules actually become due, these yellow bells will appear. So these are indicating to you that something inside these two groups is actually due as of right now, as of this very moment. Now that's a good time to point out this blue button down here, which we call filter control, here on this page. You will see different filter controls in different pages, but they always pertain to whatever you're looking at here in the center area. So we can see that we have a lot of groups that without bells, and we have two with them, which means something is due. So if we wanted to, we could come down to this filter and we can filter by all, which is what we're doing right now. We're seeing all the groups within the database or the facility, or we can just filter it out and just see what is due. So if we click on the due, you'll notice that everything disappears except the two groups with the bells. So this is an easy way to know or to filter out the information just to figure out what is actually due right now so that you can probably focus your attention on them, or at least give priority to performing these activities. So that's how you filter on the main groups page. So before we go into any of these groups to see which logs are inside of them, let's finish up this page by discussing this big orange button at the bottom called Scan. So logs in PlantLog generally represent physical equipment. They don't always have to, but very often this is how you will use logs for the majority of the time, is to track physical assets and equipment within the facility. Each log can get assigned its own barcode tag, which the administrators will define and input into the software. So it makes it very easy to actually input data for these assets, because even if you don't know where a particular log or asset might be under all these groups, you actually don't need to know this. You can just go down here and click on the scan button and scan the barcode that's located on that physical asset. And it'll take you directly to that asset, no matter where it is within this group or the hierarchy. So to scan, you're simply going to hit this button, and it's going to turn on the rear-facing camera on your device. And you're simply going to take a picture of the barcode. It's very easy. You're going to hold the camera about 4 to 6 inches away from the actual barcode tag, and the device will automatically scan it. Because we're using a simulator here, I can't actually show that to you, but you'll see it's pretty self-explanatory. And another thing to point out as a little tip is that if you find yourself in a low light condition, if the ambient light around you is kind of dark and it might be hard for the camera to read the barcode in dark or low light situations, what you can do is press and hold the scan button, and if your device supports it, it'll turn on the LED next to your camera to light up the area around that barcode tag. Not all devices are supported, so if the LED light doesn't turn on, it's not that something is broken, it just means your particular device doesn't support it. But that's a nice quick tip regarding barcode scanning. So just try it out. It's very easy to use, and it's a very quick way to input data on assets. At least it brings you straight to that asset page where you can then choose which activity you're about to perform. So now let's assume that we're moving through the facility and actually performing operator rounds. We're going to visit all the equipment, scan the barcode on them, and then input the data as specified. So we can see that some things are due in the pumps group, so let's go in there now. And now that we're in the pumps group, we can see all the logs listed in there. These are all physical assets that have been categorized under the pumps group. We can see that chilled hot water pumps 1 and 2 also have the bell on it. So this is what's telling us is actually due. Something inside of these two assets are due as of this very moment. So let's go and select chilled hot water pump number 1. And this brings us inside of this asset or log, which is represented by this clipboard icon. So one thing to note real quick here is over here in the upper right is this info icon we have. If you recall earlier, I mentioned that the PlantLog mobile app contains a subset of asset history. That kind of history or pertinent information is always stored under what we call the info view. So anytime you see this info icon up in the upper right, what it's doing is telling you that there is some extra information that you can refer to regarding whatever object that you're looking at up here. So given that we're viewing the chilled hot water pump number 1, the log for it, then the information that you'll see here pertains to this actual asset. So let's go ahead and click on that and see what we can see. All right, we can see the title of the asset we're looking at. We can see here this details section, which is things that the admin can enter when they're building up your facility. But we can see this is the manufacturer, the model of this particular pump, the serial number, support number, any kind of information that the administrator might want you to refer to when you're out and about in the facility might be shown here in the details section. Next is what we will call previous note. Any operators who previously recorded data on this asset can always optionally input a note to mark off some kind of condition, some odd behavior with the machine, and so on. You can see here that a previous user has created that note. Clean residual oil from previous maintenance work, and it just kind of gives you an idea on the status of this asset. Just extra reference information. You will see up to 6 previous notes for any given asset within the last 90 days. So it gives you a pretty nice overview of the status of this current this asset. So let's click OK. And now we could see in this section here for activities, listed all the activities that you can choose from in order to input data on. So we have a daily round, a monthly PM, and a quarterly PM. Obviously the daily round is the one with the yellow bell, so that's telling us that this is the one that's actually due as of right now. So let's go ahead and enter data for this one. Okay, we're now inside the daily round activity for the chilled hot water pump, as we can see up here. Once again, the info icon is showing in the upper right, meaning that there is some additional historical information that we might care about. So if we click on that, we can see it's telling us the last time this record was taken, the last time a daily round was performed, which was basically yesterday. It'll tell you the date and the time and the name of the user who took that reading. And now it's also, as a convenience, showing us that previous note that it showed before. So it's just nice for reference to be here. We'll click OK. And now what we're seeing here is essentially an electronic version of a paper log sheet. The forms that you might have filled out on a sheet of paper are now appearing here as rows or items within PlantLog. So let's start at the top one, which is asking for a pump status. But before we do that, let's notice here that these 4 squares are empty. And that's just basically telling us that we haven't put in any value for any of these readings just yet. So let's go to pump status. And we have now a choice between hand, off, and auto. Notice that off is already selected. And this is a setting that the admins can control. It may either be enabled or disabled. If it's enabled, then every time you visit an item, it will automatically default to the last known value for that item. This can be a nice convenience because you can reference it and understand what the condition of this asset was the last time someone checked it. But it might be turned off, in which case you would always have to select a value. So let's just switch it for the sake of change and switch it over to hand. Notice too that there's a green check mark up in this box here. This is indicating that the choice that we've given for this particular reading is considered a good reading. This is okay that the pump status is in the hand mode. So it's given us a green check mark. That's considered a good value. So let's go ahead and hit OK here. And now it'll take us back to the main list of items. And you can see now that we have put in a good value for this. So let's now go down to the next one, suction pressure. Select that. Once again, this is a numeric reading that we're taking, and it automatically defaults to 33, which is the last known value taken for the suction pressure. Once again, let's look at the info view up here and see what it tells us. It's telling us that the absolute range is from 0 to 100, and the optimal range is from 20 to 40. So let's see what that means here. Just imagine this pressure gauge being an analog gauge, kind of like a speedometer. And just imagine that the readings on that go from 0 to 100 psi. That means that there's no way that we could put in a value below 0 or above 100. But let's just try that anyway. Let's put in a value of 108. Notice how the square up here goes blank, because it's basically not going to allow us to put in a value higher than 100, because that's beyond the absolute range. So this is a feature built into the software to help prevent human errors. Say if we're distracted and you meant to put in a value of 40 psi, but accidentally hit the 0 button down here an extra time. If this wasn't in place, then you would have put in a value of 400, which would have been way off. So this is the reason why there is such thing as an absolute range. It's there to prevent us humans from making these common mistakes. Now let's go ahead and put in a value of 53. Notice that the box up here in the upper left no longer has a green check, but instead a red exclamation point. This is telling us that this is an exception, meaning this is outside of what is called optimal range. So under normal conditions, as we saw up here, the optimal range for this particular reading is from 20 to 40. So if we come back here, 53 is way above that. So we are outside of normal specs, and it's marking this off as bad data. So let's go ahead and try to save this. We'll hit OK. We're now going to be prompted with this alert. Anytime an exception value is entered in the mobile app, we will get this alert. It'll tell us what the normal range is, 20 to 40, and it's just asking us to confirm this reading. We just want to make sure that this is in fact the real reading that the equipment is experiencing. So we'll hit yes, and we've now saved one good value and one bad value. So let's go now to the discharge pressure. Enter this in here. We can see we defaulted to 63. That's a good value. And something I want to point out now is that we do not always need to go and hit the OK button in order to take us back to that main list. If we want to go to the next reading in this particular form, we can simply hit the down button right here, and it'll take us directly to the next reading. So let's do that instead this time. We'll go down, and now it's asking us to record any unusual vibrations. If we say no, that's considered good. If there are unusual vibrations, we could say yes, and obviously that's considered an exception. So this is the difference between something that's considered good or bad. Let's take a look at the info view again real quick, and it'll give us, in this case, it's got some details on telling us what to do in order to determine whether there are any unusual vibrations. So again, refer to the info view as whenever you see it. It's usually supplying some helpful information. So now that we've entered in a value for the last item in this particular activity, the down arrow is now disabled because we can't go down any further than we already have. So let's just hit the OK button. And now this green bar here you'll see has been completed all the way to the right. This means we have completed all the readings that's required to do the daily round, and we can now simply save this record and have it completed. But there's one more thing we can do if we like, and that is under here in this optional section. We can add a note for ourselves if we find something odd or noteworthy regarding this particular activity that we just did. So let's just go do that. We'll click on note, and this is where you can enter in an optional note. So let's just put in something like this is a test. And notice once again, the info icon is there. So if we were to tap on this, it'll show us once again that previous note that was there, but it has something else added to it, which is a copy button. So let's just say the status of this asset is still in the same state that's outlined in this particular note. We can, rather than retyping it in, we can simply say copy, and whatever was in that previous note will get copied into the current note. And that's just a way to just save some time. So let's go ahead and just add this as a current note. We'll hit done, and now we'll just save that. We'll hit OK. And now finally we'll hit the save button to save this record. And we're now taken back to the list of logs within the pumps group, and you can now see that chilled hot water pump number 1 no longer has the bell on it because we've completed the activity that was due, but it also has this synchronization icon over here to the right. And all this is telling us is that we have created some data against this asset, but has not yet been synced to the main internet server, because as you remember, we are still in offline mode at this point. So this data is stored locally on the device until we perform a sync to transfer it to the main service. Let's continue along now to the next asset that has a scheduled activity which is due, which is the next chilled hot water pump. So let's select that as if we were going to go to input a record for it. And now let's assume that this particular pump is actually offline. It might be having some issues and is taken offline. Maybe someone else is performing a PM or maintenance on it. But for whatever reason, you're unable to perform the daily round that is scheduled for this particular asset. There's no need to go in and input any readings or any bogus readings for that, because that could affect the overall history of this asset. Instead, when you encounter an asset that you cannot perform an activity on, such as a daily round, you can simply come down here to this button at the bottom, which we call the inactive button. So you can temporarily set this log or asset to be inactive because you've just verified that it is not currently online. So if we click on the inactive button, it'll ask us to confirm this. We'll click yes. And now this whole entire asset has been set to inactive. We've been returned to the groups, the pumps group, and now we can see that the chilled hot water pump number 2 has that inactive icon sitting on top of it. That's just telling us that it is disabled and we no longer need to reference it while we're going throughout and doing our rounds. This is a good time to point out the filter control down here in the lower right. If you recall, when we're looking at a list of groups, we can filter them by all of them or which ones are due. In the case of when we're looking inside a group with a list of logs, we can change the filter to all, which is what we're currently viewing, or to which ones are done or which ones we still need to do. So for example, if we now choose on done, we can see that we've already created that record for chilled hot water pump number 1. You can see with the sync icon. So that's telling us what's done. And if we come back here again and click on to do, it's now only showing us the logs in here that have no records whatsoever created for them. And you'll notice that it also has hidden the chilled hot water pump number 2 because we've already visited that asset and indicated that it is currently offline and have set it to inactive. So it's been removed from our to-do list. So setting a filter to to-do within a large group is a handy way of knowing which assets you still haven't visited when you're doing your rounds. Because once you've completed a record for one of them, it will be removed from this list. And once there's nothing left in this list, obviously you can be assured that you've completed your rounds for this particular group. Okay, one more thing to point out here. Let's just assume we're continuing doing our rounds and we get to a particular asset, maybe say this one. We scan the barcode on the asset. That brings us to this screen. We then choose the activity we're about to perform, and we start to input the values for the items. Let's just do this one. Let's do one more. Okay. Now for here, discharge pressure. Let's assume that we are reading this value from an analog gauge just as we were before. Let's also assume that this particular gauge is broken in some fashion. Either the glass around it is broken, maybe the needle inside is jammed, and we're just not able to put in an accurate value for this particular item. We also wouldn't want to do something such as put in a value of 0, because that's a real value and would throw off the trending and the historical analysis for this particular reading. So in these situations, when you're not able to put in an accurate reading, we can come down here, much like we did when we set the entire asset to inactive when it's offline. We can set individual items to inactive as well. So we would come down here and we would click the inactive button, and this would ask just for us to confirm it. Once we confirm, we have now set the discharge pressure item to inactive. This allows us to bypass the input of an actual value because we're unable at this time to put in an accurate reading. So this is the only time that you can get around inputting a value in the PlantLog software when doing your rounds. So let's go ahead and hit OK. And now that we can see, we have the inactive icon showing up in this box, basically saying there's no value in here whatsoever. Okay, that pretty much sums up how to work with logs in the mobile app. At this point, we can go back to the main list of groups and continue our route while performing the facility rounds. One more thing to point out is we still have this group here with the bell for cooling towers. Well, let's go inside here, and now notice that on the right hand side we have these padlocks appearing. And this is a setting that you'll see more often than not, where the administrators can restrict data input for any of the assets until a user has scanned the barcode. So if we actually go to input some data on this cooling tower number 1, if we select it, we'll see that pop-up that says scan required. That simply means that the only way we're allowed to input data for this particular asset is to come down, walk up in front of the actual asset, and then scan the barcode that's located on that asset. And what that is doing is proving that we are physically in front of the asset, and it also helps with data accuracy. So for example, these two cooling towers might be located right next to each other, and it's another common mistake that someone can do where they walk up and they actually select the wrong cooling tower and fill it out, and they might have filled out the information for cooling tower number 1 when in fact they actually were standing in front of cooling number 2. So it's an easy mistake to do, and barcodes help prevent those kind of mistakes. So here's a quick tip regarding navigation since you've gotten this far. Let's just assume you're navigating through the hierarchy here in the logs feature. Maybe let's say we go into the inventory group here. And yes, PlantLog can be used for tracking inventory. Let's then just say we go into a subgroup called air filters. And then we happen to be looking to one of these air filters here, and we're in this level here. And then let's just say that you want to go all the way back to the top level logs page. You could always hit the back arrow several times to go back to where you came from, but there's a shortcut to doing this, and that is rather than pressing the back arrow several times, you can simply press and hold the back arrow, and that will teleport you back to the top level page within whatever feature that you're in. So we'll do that now. And we are now taken back to the top level log screen. And this is just a quick way to get back rather than hitting the back arrow several times. One thing to note though about that feature is that if you were in the middle of inputting any data and you did the teleport back to the main screen, you will be discarding any of that data that you entered. It will not be saved. It will automatically discard that and send you back to the top level page. So that's something to be aware of. Finally, let's take a look at the journals feature. We'll select journals from the nav panel right here, and we will be taken to the top level section for the journals feature. So journals are a way to document events that have taken place throughout the facility. It's basically you're generally, when you make a journal entry, you are documenting events that have taken place in the past. It's also a good way to communicate with your direct peers. So in this example here, we could see that we have some journals, one for electricians, and one for mechanics. We have a general shift communications for any kind of communications amongst all craft responsibilities. And finally, one for the supervisors where they will communicate with each other. So based on your job role, you might have journals laid out in this way. If you were a mechanic, you would probably focus here on the mechanics journal. Maybe everyone will contribute to the shift communications journal. But the idea here is to document events that have taken place on your shift so that operators or other engineers coming on shift can actually review those journal entries right here on the mobile device and kind of get a feel for what's been going on within the facility. So let's go ahead and take a look in the shift communications journal. We'll click on it. And now we're inside of the actual journal itself. Once again, let's notice that there's the info icon in the upper right. So there is some additional info we can read. Let's click on that. And in this case, we're getting some additional details text that the admin has entered. And this is just instructions on what to use this particular journal for. It might also list things not to use this journal for, but this is just the details. We'll click OK. And now we're seeing the most recent journal entries that have taken place that are being placed under the shift communications journal. So remember, PlantLog Mobile operates primarily offline. So what is happening is that every time you sync the device, you tap the sync button, you will get the most recent 50 journal entries for each journal that's in your facility. So what you're looking at here is the most recent 50 entries, which should be good enough to kind of get a feel for what's been going on since you have last been on shift. If you wanted to look at the entire history for a particular journal, that would be something used in the web application. That would not be here in the mobile app. Let's look again at the filter control down here in the lower right. So if you recall, a lot of the other feature pages have this control as well, but it'll depend on what feature that you're on will dictate what can be filtered. In the case of journals, we are looking at events that have taken place in the past. So the first filter, the default filter, will be by date. Then you can see here these sections that are dividing up these journal entries. So we have the entries that have taken place in the past 7 days, the ones in the past 90 days, and so on. We can also filter by user. So if we want to look at the most recent entries created by a particular user, it'll break that up. These gray sections will list the user's name, and any entries they've created will be shown under that section. And finally, we can filter by category. And category is, we're going to go into that in a moment here, but basically it's a way to categorize your journal entries so that it's not just a description of what took place, but you can categorize it, which makes it a lot easier to search. So for example, obviously this is a fire alarm, and if a fire alarm went off, you would want to categorize it under that so people can quickly find all the events that have taken place when a fire alarm went off or something to that effect. Okay, let's create a new journal record to see what that's like. We'll click the plus button at the bottom, and we're taken to the Add New Record screen. So the first thing we need to enter is a category, or we need to choose one. And a category, what we want to do here is pick the best category that matches the description we're about to enter. So if it's a general maintenance event that we want to document, we would of course choose maintenance. We might want to choose general. These are the options that the administrator has given to us, and we just want to find the best match. Let's real quick though choose fire alarm and see what that's like. So notice the exception dialog appears. If you recall back from the logs feature, exceptions are any kind of data or condition within the facility that are deemed to be either abnormal or severe in nature. And obviously a fire alarm can potentially be severe, so the administrator has deemed it to be an exception. And once again, we just simply need to confirm whether this is truly the category that we're choosing. So I just wanted to point that out to you, that journal entries can be categorized as an exception, similar to how a journal or a log item can be deemed an exception. But let's just say no here. We're not actually going to do that. Just wanted to point that out. Instead, let's choose a category for, say, maintenance. Okay. Click Done. And now we have this field here called Occurred. Now remember that journals are generally used to record events that have taken place in the past. And for that reason, we want to enter a date and time for the Occurred section to reflect when the event had actually taken place, not necessarily the time that we're recording it, which is actually now. So let's go under the date and time, and we can say, let's say it was today, but it was, let's say it was actually 11 a.m. Okay, it happened at 11 a.m. And now we can enter the entry. And the entry is just simply a body of text that you would enter to describe what had taken place. So we could say the BMI Incorporated visited to do PMs on chillers 1 and 2. So just an example. We're just demonstrating so the other engineers that come on shift can review these entries and kind of get an idea of what's been going on recently. We click Done, and now we simply say Save here. We're taken back to the main entry here. Now we're sorting by category. Let's go back and sort by date, and you will notice here is our most recent entry that we just created. Remember, we logged in as Brian Dawkins. Here's the entry. Our category is maintenance, and also notice this sync icon here in the upper right. Once again, this is just saying that we've created this record, but it has not yet been synchronized with the main internet server. It is still sitting here on our main device locally until we actually perform a sync. Then it will get transferred up, and everyone else will be able to view it at that time. Okay, that's it for this tutorial. Be sure to watch other videos in this series which cover different aspects of the PlantLog software.